Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's national call. I'm going to give it a minute or so more to allow for more people to join before we start with the agenda. Thank you. Hi, if you're just joining, thanks for being here. I'm going to give it about a minute more before we start with the agenda. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition. I'm glad to welcome you all to today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable homes. Thanks so much for joining today. It's a busy and consequential week for housing in America. I do have some updates to share. I'm just looking to see if one of our speakers has joined yet. Okay, so I wanted to share a few updates. The first, briefly on reconciliation and the reconciliation bill that we've all been working so hard on for over a year now, which now looks very likely to move forward without any of the housing investments that are included in the Build Back Better Act. And clearly this is just a tremendously unfortunate and short-sighted decision by Congress. The legislation is, I think, ironically called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it doesn't address skyrocketing rents or the dwindling housing supply, which are key drivers of inflation. And it leaves the lowest income renters and people experiencing homelessness to continue to suffer from continued inaction. And so Sarah will share more on the reconciliation bill in a little bit. But a couple things that I just wanted to mention related to this first, and much more to come in the weeks and months to come. But as you all know, this congressional inaction can really have devastating consequences for the lowest income people. So we need to do all we can to protect against such consequences. So if Congress is not going to act quickly, then we need the Biden administration to take immediate steps to protect America's lowest income and most marginalized renters from these really harmful impacts of inflation and rising rents, high rates of eviction filings, and increasing homelessness. So we are going to be in the coming days and weeks calling on the Biden administration to take action to establish critical renter protections to keep renters stably housed, just as several states have in place laws to prevent price or rent gouging after natural disasters, which many of our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition partners helped get into law in those states. The Biden administration should implement anti-rent gouging measures to prevent landlords from imposing these exorbitant rent increases that we are seeing in the wake of a global pandemic. There's clear precedent and need for using all levers possible to stem unreasonable rent increases. We're also going to be pushing the Biden administration to expand renter protections to those who are living in properties with federally backed mortgages, which is another area where there's very recent precedent for tying renter protections to federally backed loans or other assistance from the work that we did collectively during the pandemic. And we're urging the Biden administration to again activate FEMA's public assistance program, which they did during the pandemic to help move people who were experiencing homelessness out of shelters and encampments into hotels and permanent housing. And clearly with homelessness increasing in many communities, that's needed now more than ever. So tomorrow I'll be testifying before the full Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. They're holding a hearing on the impacts of the current housing market on renters. So I have the honor and the pleasure to testify, and this will be part of the testimony that I share. I also wanted to share that, also tomorrow, of course, is the White House Eviction Prevention Summit, which hopefully you have all heard about and already registered for. And when Gene Sperling joins us, we'll hear more about it from him. There are already 4,000 people registered for that event tomorrow. That takes place from 12:30 to 2:30 as a virtual event. There's room for plenty more people to register, so I encourage all of you to. And we'll hear more about that soon. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we know that as homelessness is increasing, so too is a backlash to individual people who are experiencing homelessness and to the solutions to homelessness. And we're seeing it on Capitol Hill. And I know you all are certainly seeing it in your communities at the state and local level, whether it's efforts to criminalize homelessness, whether it's sweeps of encampments without any safe and effective alternatives, or it's the dangerous anti-homelessness rhetoric that we're all hearing. So it's really critical that all of us are unified in pushing back against these really counterproductive efforts. So we have mentioned in the past the guide, the toolkit that NLHC's policy and field teams put together, and we shared with all of you recently for what you can be doing during congressional recess now, and certainly pushing back against these harmful narratives is one important piece of that. So we are also going to be having a series of webinars throughout August in lieu of our regular HoUSed campaign calls. Since Congress is going to be on recess, we're going to focus on doing these joint webinars that the National Income Housing Coalition is going to do together with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And we're going to invite advocates from across the country to join this 4-part webinar series on homelessness and housing first. It's really to equip you all with the data and the information and the messages to help us have this unified front to push back against these harmful narratives. So there'll be 4 webinars, and during them we're going to invite and hear from experts on the emerging threats that are facing people experiencing homelessness, some of the proven strategies to end homelessness and advance housing justice, and ways that advocates and people with lived experience can work together to take actions. So the first webinar, again, will be on Monday, August 15th at this time, 2:30 to 4 o'clock. And every 2 weeks then for a series of 4 webinars, we'll be holding these together with the Alliance. And we will share out a full agenda for each of these webinars soon. We'll be sending an e-blast from NLHC to our full network, and you'll be able to register for those webinars soon. So please look out for that and plan to join us. We did it at the same time as these calls because you all already have it on your calendar, and so hopefully that makes it easier for you all to join. So it looks like Jean is going to be joining very shortly. So while I wait, I'll just tell you a little bit more about these webinars. So as I said, on August 15th from 2:30 to 4, that's our first webinar. That one will be on emerging threats facing people experiencing homelessness. The second webinar will be on August 29th, same time, 2:30 to 4, and it will provide all of the data we all need to show definitively that homelessness is indeed an issue of a lack of affordable, accessible housing. On Monday, September 12th, we will have a webinar on the long-term solutions and successful strategies to addressing homelessness. And then on Monday, September 26th, will be the fourth and final in the series from 2:30 to 4. And that one will be on ways to address unsheltered homelessness from a public health perspective. So we have some great speakers already lined up for those webinars. I'm looking forward to them, and I hope you all can join. I'm going to pause for just a moment to see whether Gene is on. I think he's joining soon. Let's see, I see a couple of questions in the question box. Claudia Swaney says we should camp out on the Mall of Washington and make a statement on the need for affordable housing. And there's an anonymous attendee who's asking whether unhoused people or people with lived experience have been involved in the Eviction Prevention Summit tomorrow. There are none listed as speakers for the event. So I think Gene can speak to that a little bit more when he joins. No, I don't believe that there are people who are experiencing homelessness or other people with lived experience on the agenda for tomorrow. I do believe that this is intended as a series of events, this one being the first. So, you know, they do want to have tenants and other people that are impacted in part of their public facing events. They also want to have emergency rental assistance program administrators who aren't on the agenda for tomorrow at future events as well. And I do know that they have had some meetings with impacted people at the White House, but I don't believe it's part of tomorrow's event. So again, we can check with Jean, although I think by the time Jean joins, we're probably not going to be able to do Q&A today. Let's see if there's any other questions while we're waiting. The event tomorrow, will it be recorded? I don't know. We can ask Jean that also tomorrow. Looks like some people have been asking, what is NLIC doing to help encourage state and local governments to use their funding to help prevent and end homelessness in the wake of Congress's decision? That's a great question that comes from Ali Rabe. So one of the things we've been doing is tracking how states and localities have been using their state and local fiscal relief fund dollars. Elena from our policy team has headed up that project with a few others from the team, and they have found that so far states and localities have set aside about almost $13 billion to use for affordable housing production or preservation or addressing homelessness. And in some cases that relates to shelters or a bridge for emergency rental assistance or longer term rental assistance. So $13 billion is significant, certainly meaningful in many of those communities. And it's out of a bucket of $350 billion that has a really broad range of uses. So we're encouraging our state and local partners to really press state and local governments to do more with that money, because you're absolutely right to the questioner that there are significant resources in many communities that could be used right now to house people experiencing homelessness, or at least get them into safer situations like in hotels or motels. So we are pushing states and localities to do that. I really encourage everybody else to. It looks like Elena put in the chat box something on the materials that we have ready. Oh, I see Jean has joined. Great. Hi, Jean. I was just filibustering a little bit.
The frustrating part is I've been able to hear you and you haven't been able to see me. So I've heard a little.
No. Oh, no. Oh, no. Well, I'm so glad to have you. We're glad to have you whenever it is. And I'm glad to reintroduce Jean to everybody on the call. I know that all of you know him well. He's been on this call many times to share with us updates from the White House, to hear feedback from all of us on what more is needed. So just as a reminder, Jean is a senior advisor to President Biden, who appointed him as a coordinator for the multi-trillion-dollar American Rescue Plan. And Jean has really been a good friend to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and to our partners, just regularly seeking out, genuinely listening to, and improving programs based on our collective feedback. So today he joins us to talk a little bit more about the White House's latest efforts to increase housing supply and to talk some more about tomorrow's White House Eviction Prevention Summit. So thanks so much for joining us, Jean. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And look, I promise that I will return, Diane, later when we have more time and when we can do more Q&A, and perhaps come on with some of my Treasury colleagues as well. I just want to make a couple of points up top, and then I want to talk a little bit about what this summit is that we're doing tomorrow and some of what we hope to get out of it. First thing I want to say, and I think some of you have heard me say this, is I'm at the point right now where people often are asking for what are lessons learned in implementing the American Rescue Plan. And one of them that I say repeatedly, in which I cite the people on this call and Diane and the Low Income Housing Coalition specifically, which is the importance of a White House looking at the experts and advocates on the ground, not as outreach strategy, not as just getting validation or handling issues, but as an essential feedback loop in implementing an emergency program. I went to lots of conferences in between White Houses that talked about evidence-based learning, and they all seem to think the gold standard is, after something's done, you do a study on it, you do a random controlled experiment, you find out 2 or 3 years exactly what worked. Well, nobody on this call had that luxury. We were all trying to do something historic, have a national eviction policy proposal, and it had to work in a number of months. And there wasn't, history of past efforts. And I think that without the dialogue that we've had, I think Diane and I talk about it starting with a 3-hour call while I was in Northern California, constantly losing coverage. But if it was not for all that we heard from from the people on this call, I don't think the emergency rental assistance could have possibly gotten out with the speed it needed. We all know that March and April, even though those were historic amounts that went out, were way too slow to have the impact we wanted and to make sure we had enough going out by the time the moratorium ended. And virtually every single thing we did was not us sitting around a table dreaming things up or just waiting to the next year when we got reporting. We were hearing from you about the problems with slow applications, about the fact that people were closing the books when a landlord said no and not using direct tenant views, about discrimination against people in federal housing, where even though we technically couldn't affect some of those things, we put out a warning about disparate impact investigations, the need to make sure that this was available to those who were already homeless, to come up with a way of being able to establish that there was an obligation going forward, understanding why some cities were kind of crushing it from the beginning with simplified applications, and others were being overly risk averse. All of that just came through with massive outreach, but to no group more than the people on this call. And the fact we turned around in May, turned around in June, turned around in August, where we really made clear, as clear as we could be on the self-attestation. So it's not just the grantees, but they felt confident. Their state auditors knew that. All of these things were inspired by our dialogue. And yes, of course, there's always going to be tension, and you're always stuck with certain limits, when you're in the government. But, it's not about having, not having tension. It's about learning quickly and adjusting quickly so that we can, save the dignity and the sense of housing and security of hundreds of thousands of millions of people who are already at risk and hard pressed. That's what it's about. I just want to say this dialogue, this back and forth, oh yeah, it will frustrate sometimes when you're in the White House and you think you've done 4 good things and somebody points out the 5th. But you know what? That doesn't matter. What matters is that this ongoing dialogue, as things are moving and changing and we're dealing with first-time issues, is happening. So when I say that this was implementation from the bottom up, that it was by everyone, I mean, it's just not a saying. It is just the reality. You cannot look at the new guidance in May, June, and August and not see the fingerprints all over it. The constant push for diversion policies, the push for better legal representation, all of these were, again, not being invented around some, table in some government room. They were coming from our interactions. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is that we are focused on very many things in this space. And so, a lot of you hold conferences, you hold sessions. Not every session is meant to deal with every issue. And so, for example, if we're doing an issue on tenant protections, it doesn't mean we don't care about housing supply. If we're doing stuff on reform for emergency rental assistance, it doesn't mean we're not focused on other issues as well. We just need to do a focus now and then so we can break through on that particular issue. So we have met several times with groups organized by Tara and others. We are planning more things, more issues there. Obviously, housing supply and affordability and prices is a critical issue, which is going to be a focus for us. We just announced just one piece of the housing supply action plan the other day, which again is not nearly enough, but you do everything you can. And this was about giving state and local fiscal recovery funds a wider range of affordable housing projects, which would be presumably eligible, that would making clear that as long as the state or locality is financing affordable rental housing project that provides long-term affordability for at least 20 years to those below 65% of the local median income, that it's allowable. And making clear that updated guidance, the flexibility to use state and local fiscal recovery funds for long-term affordability, as long as there's commitment of 20 years. I mean, again, these are not things that were dreamed up. This is what we've heard from many of you as being helpful. We're going to continue to work on the administrative. We're going to continue to work on the legislative side. So, I've gotten questions about, we've gotten questions from the landlord folks. There's not landlords in the summit. There's not a tenants in there. There's not the operators. Those are all correct. But I think what we're doing is a worthy focus If it was the only thing we're doing, I think it would be problematic. But I think we will come back and continue to do policy, to do outreach, to do summits, listening sessions, internal discussions, as well as public things. I think the reason why it was important and why we wanted to do this, and of course we were planning this 6 weeks ago, is that we saw now that the emergency rental assistance plans program funding, after what was a frustrating start for all of us, are now moving out at a quick pace. You know, we now think that in the neighborhood of 40 billion is out or committed by now. And we want to send a strong message, which is that this is not an area where we want to go back to normal. I mean, if you run the American Rescue Plan core implementation, you spend a lot of time wanting things to go back to normal, wanting people to go back to normal in terms of going out to restaurants or to doing all sorts of other things that would show we were returning to normal. We want to send a big message out there that eviction policy is not one of those cases. Going back to normal would be a shame. It would be a crime, and we can't let that happen, because what we inherited was a world in which there was no national policy on eviction prevention, no national infrastructure to implement such a policy. We know that there were very few eviction diversion programs, very few right to counsel programs around the country. And, you know, it's interesting, when I was at the lessons learned session that Brookings and the Hamilton Project were doing, one of their main lessons was you shouldn't ever in an emergency try to create a brand new infrastructure. You should only build on existing infrastructure. Well, thank God you all didn't listen to that, because I was here trying to implement. The people on this call made this historic thing happen. And maybe, you know, in March and April, it seemed like, you know, it was too much to build decentralized an infrastructure in over 450 places and expect it to be up and going in time to help enough people to prevent an eviction tsunami. Maybe it seemed like it was too difficult, but none of the people on the call would take that for an answer. We certainly wouldn't take that for an answer. And so now the question has to be, now that we've built this up, now that we've seen us go from a handful of court diversion plans to a couple of hundred, now that we're seeing the rise in legal representation, now that we're seeing, thanks to the challenge we made out to law schools, 99 law school clinics adding to this, is it okay to go back? Is it okay to let the infrastructure crumble? Is it okay to let all these reforms crumble? And so we wanted to do something tomorrow, the purpose of which was to note that while we all have, and literally me included, everybody on this call is going to have things that we thought were initially problematic, or things that were still problematic, or lessons learned, all of these things that we want to, that it is important to kind of recognize what was done in the last year. Because this is not, let me just say, this is not, and it never will be, mission accomplished. Every avoidable eviction is an avoidable heartbreak. It's an avoidable scarring of families and their children. You can't be happy or satisfied when, even when national numbers look strong, that there were areas and glitches that kept people from getting the relief that they needed. It would be wrong to not recognize that and to not learn lessons from that. But we would be making a big mistake if we also did not communicate to the world, to American policymakers everywhere, that something historic happened here, that this was a very dramatic and successful experiment in progressive government. There was never a national eviction policy, never, not in the New Deal, not in the Great Society, never until the people on this call helped push it and make it happen. And, you know, we're now seeing that contrary to what some people thought, that we're actually going to be able to get these funds out, you know, virtually all of them, virtually all within 2 years, or at least committed, which is extraordinary from where things looked like in March and April of last year. Secondly, we are now seeing that there's no question that there's been over 6 million payments to households, and soon I think we'll be able to clearly say over 6 million payments to distinct households. I mean, that's extraordinary, 6 million. Of course, there's still way too much pain from evictions and from rising prices now, but let's also note, according to the Eviction Lab, we are 26% below historic averages on eviction filings since the eviction moratorium ended. 26% below. Remember, some people, even on this call, were projecting that it would be 300%, that it would triple, that there would be an onslaught. So much of that is because of the work people did and because of the 6 million people who got emergency rental assistance, 6 million households. So to recognize that is not to say mission accomplished. It is not to denigrate or overlook the pain that happened unnecessarily to too many families who, again, were the victims of startup glitches, lack of capacity, overly complicated applications, particularly at the start. It is simply to say that this is something we want to build on and we want to improve on, but we have to make clear to people that it is something historic that you want to build on. I promise you, Social Security and Medicare didn't look as great, didn't look perfect after their first years, but they were huge and important experiments in progressive government that people both celebrated and built on, both celebrated the importance of, but then stressed the things that had to be done to get things right. And so what we wanted to do tomorrow is get some of those innovations where people are building on the ERA for lasting reform. And so we will start with an open, we'll open with an overview, which will be myself and then Matthew Desmond, as you all know, author of Evicted and head of the Princeton Eviction Lab, and then your own Diane will be the three kind of opening speakers. And then what we did is we looked for where there was statewide reform being led from the Chief Justice level. We wanted people to see what the Chief Justice of Michigan is doing, what the Chief Justice of New Mexico is doing, what the Chief Judge of New Orleans is doing, because we want to push and again say, you can't go back. We need to build on. So we wanted to point to places where people were doing that very thing. And then we picked 5 places around the country. You could have picked a lot more, but we thought they were good examples. Philadelphia in mandating pre-filing election diversion and prohibiting harmful tenant screening practices. We're having the mayor of Chicago come in to talk about what they've done on their access to legal services for tenants and early eviction resolution. We are going to Cleveland to talk about the permanent adoption of right to counsel in serving tenants at the highest risk of eviction. And Colorado with their eviction defense project and how they've built up a system and their push to get ongoing state legislative funding to continue that. And then Oregon as well, that has a statewide partnership to provide rapid eviction prevention to the highest risk tenants. So this is not a summit that is designed to do everything. It's really designed to say, we want to point to people building lasting reform, building on ERA, and we wanted to do this by letting people who are coming on, letting those in the media know that this program, as imperfect as it is, has also been historic and is really the most significant eviction prevention strategy and built up infrastructure in the history of our country. No question about it. And to show examples of the type of things that we can push people to continue. And of course, we want to do it now because while I think all of us have many different legislative goals, there is still funding in the state and local levels. Lots of it's been allocated, but there is still ability for people to push towards best practice. There is still ability with people's housing stability funds to do that. So our view was, we want to do this right now. And that's the reason for our timing. So again, I really would hate if people thought that because we weren't getting to everything, that it meant in some way we were downplaying it. And again, we'll end up doing things on tenant protection. We'll end up doing things on housing supply affordability, both policy-wise, both outreach-wise, both summit-wise. All of those type of things we'll do. When we do one, it doesn't mean we're not focusing on, we're downplaying the other. It just practically, this one is already, an hour and 50 minutes. We're really pleased that Sherrod Brown will be joining and helping to close our session. So again, I really want to explain what this was meant to be, also what it's not designed to cover. And, as I said at the very start, all of the benefit here has often been being pushed, responding, hearing challenges on the ground, hearing ideas. We obviously, our view on so much is, you'd always love the silver bullet. When there's not a silver bullet or you can't get a silver bullet done, you do everything you can. And that's our goal, to do everything we can. And that's why we're going to continue to look on the legislative front. We're going to look for things like this Treasury guidance that we did, where we're hearing again from people on the ground that this could help. So we want your ideas. We want your thoughts. We can't cover everything in any one conference. We never will be able to. But I think doing focus conferences, focus summits that can help educate the public, the media, others, and to share. And one of the things I hear all the time is, please let us know when there are best practices out there. I hear this from mayor, county leaders, governors all the time. So I think this is a worthy effort and a worthy time to do it. And we are very open to hearing about what else we should do, not just myself, but Treasury, Erica Pothig, who is working very hard and kind of running our internal tenant protection process right now. And obviously, we all know the enormous challenges that we face on the supply and price side, and that this is a long-term issue in our country that is biting particularly hard now, and hurting people's lives. And we will not lose our focus on that as well. So again, thank you for giving me a chance to come on and explain our summit tomorrow. We hope people will listen. We're very interested in coming back and engaging and taking questions at a later time. And Diane also on what additional things we can do, both legislative wise. I know there's lots of ideas there, but administrative as well, and what we can do on things like this to help get the word out. So thank you as always for having me.
Thanks so much for joining, Gene. I really appreciate your remarks and your dedication to this work. I look forward to tomorrow's summit. I look forward to participating. I thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to future events, as you said, and ensuring that people with lived expertise are also panelists at some of the future events that I know you're planning for. So I know that you are out of time. We have lots of really good questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A box. So we won't have time to get to them today. Gina, I'm gonna pull them together and send them to you so you can read them.
That would be great. They limit chat for those of us at the White House, so I would love it if you sent them to me.
I will. I'll send you everything from the chat and the Q&A box, and we'll certainly take you up on having you back sometime soon and having a more robust Q&A and conversation. Thanks so much, Jean.
Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Sadian. She's going to give an update from Capitol Hill on reconciliation and appropriations. And then I am also going to leave the rest of the call in Sarah's capable hands, because unfortunately I also have to run. So again, thank you all so much for participating. Thanks for all of our speakers. I'll be sure to watch the recording later, and I'll turn it over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Diane. I think we're actually gonna move things a little bit around in our agenda. I'll give a Capitol Hill update at the end if there's time, but I wanna make sure we hear from our other speakers too. We're gonna start with Emma Foley, who's gonna give an update on our new Out of Reach 2022 report. This is a resource that I know many of you guys can use in your communities with your advocacy. It's really important information here. And so I look forward to hearing from Emma.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So like Sarah said, today I'll be providing you with an overview of this year's Out of Reach report and some of the key themes and findings. And we can go ahead, thank you. This year's report can be accessed at nlihc.org/OOR, and we can put that link in the chat as well. In addition to the report, the Out of Reach website includes interactive state pages where you can find data for each county and metro area in your state, and an interactive map displaying housing wages at the zip code level. Each year, Out of Reach answers the question, how much does a full-time worker need in order to afford rent and utilities at fair market rent? The fair market rent is a HUD estimate of what a household moving today would have to pay for a modest apartment in a given area. And our definition of affordability aligns with the federal standard that households should pay no more than 30% of their income towards rent. This year, we find that a full-time worker must earn $25.82 per hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent, and must earn $21.25 per hour to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent. This year's report finds once again that nowhere in the United States do minimum wage workers earn enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent. Next slide. In addition to the national housing wage, Out of Reach includes housing wages for each state, metropolitan area, county, and combined non-metropolitan areas within a state. This map shows the 2-bedroom housing wage for each state, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. As you might expect, housing wages are the highest in traditionally high-cost states like California, New York, Massachusetts, and Hawaii. But despite differences across states, the housing wage exceeds $15 in nearly every state. Next slide, please. The report also compares the cost of housing to what renter households in a variety of circumstances can afford. This graph shows, for example, that the national 1-bedroom fair market rent is $1,105, and the national 2-bedroom fair market rent is $1,342. Households relying on supplemental security income, however, can only afford $252 per month. Households relying on unemployment insurance can only afford $529 per month, and households with incomes at the poverty level can only afford $694 per month. All of these fall far short of the 1- and 2-bedroom fair market rents. Next slide. The 1- and 2-bedroom housing wages are not just, or 1- and 2-bedroom wages are not just unaffordable for minimum wage workers, but workers in a number of large occupations. 11 of the 25 largest occupations in the country pay a median hourly wage that is lower than the 1- and 2-bedroom housing wages. Workers in these 11 occupations make up 35% of the total US workforce, excluding farm workers. These occupations include things like food and beverage services, retail services, food preparation workers, home health aides, and nursing assistants. Amid record-breaking rental prices, this year's report also focuses on the significant rent increases affecting so many communities across the country. Next slide. We examine historical rent prices across 345 metropolitan counties and found that between the first quarter of 2021 and the first quarter of 2022, rental prices in the median county increased $179. This is far higher than the previous 4 years, where the median county increased between $25 and $39. To help tell the story of how rent increases are impacting tenants, we interviewed approximately 10 tenants who experienced a rent increase over the last year. These tenant stories spoke to nearly all of the key themes of Out of Reach and are interspersed throughout each section of the report. Next slide. The report also highlights the huge disparities that Black, Latino, and Indigenous households face in affording housing compared to white households. These disparities are illustrated in this graph, which shows hourly wages by percentile for Black, Hispanic, and white households. While the median white household at the 50th percentile can nearly afford a 2-bedroom home, the median Black and Hispanic households cannot even afford a 1-bedroom home. The report concludes with a call to action for sustained federal investments in rental housing. Next slide. And there's a lot more data in the report and on our website. And so if you have any questions about the data in Out of Reach, feel free to reach out to me, Emma Foley, at efoley@nlihc.org. And now I will hand it back to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emma. I want to ask you a quick question because you make a note of some of the rent increases that we're seeing most recently. Can you speak a little bit about to what extent inflation has figured into some of the numbers that are in this, or if this is looking at pre-inflation numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in terms of how fair market rents are determined, those actually came out in August of 2021. And so the fair market rents are kind of determined before this record-breaking inflation started to occur. And so as a result, it's likely that the experiences of low-income renters and rent increases are actually worse than the fair market rents that we've used in this report, because the rent increases might not quite be captured in those fair market rents that we use. And we also talk in the report a bit about some of the causes of these rental increases, including things like record high demand of rental units, which is partially a result of people being priced out of the home buying market, as well as record low vacancy rates and increased investor purchases as well.
Thanks, Emma. I also want to just make a tie back to what Diane mentioned earlier at the top of the call, which is that a lot of what she's going to be testifying about tomorrow in the Senate Banking Committee is about the very data that Emma is presenting here and also needed solutions. So if you're able to join on and check out Diane's testimony tomorrow, we welcome your participation in that. I know I'll be there and watching and cheering her on as well. I wanted to just ask one more question for you, Emma. How can advocates use this data to push for policy solutions that are needed?
That's a great question. And we have great state partners in almost every state and local partners that are using this data to do exactly that. I think this data it's helpful because it gets down to the county and metro level. And so you can really show specifically within your community, kind of illustrate what the problem is, and then use the report and key themes highlighted in the report to highlight, some of the issues that are most pressing in your community. And so I would say also be sure to check out our social media. We're sharing, reports from our state partners and how they're using this advocacy. And so I think it offers some great examples for how people can kind of package this information in a way that's relevant to policymakers near them.
Yeah, that's great. I know one of the facts that from the report that I've already started circulating among members of Congress and other policymakers is that factoid that you shared about how 11 of the 25 largest occupations pay less than what it costs to afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And to me, that really shows how this is a structural issue. This is not about individual choices or helping one person here or there find affordable housing. This is a systemic issue that needs attention from policymakers at all levels. So I really appreciated that. Thanks for joining on the call, Emma. If there are other questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, I'd love to invite you to stay on. And now we will turn to Pierce Greenberg, who's from Creighton University. He's going to give an update for our Erase projects. Pierce.
Hi, thanks. So let's see. Looks like I can control the screen. All right, thanks. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a small part of an Erase project that we've been working on here in Omaha, looking at disparities in the emergency rental assistance program. So I worked on this project in collaboration with Together Omaha, Nebraska Appleseed, and the Nebraska Housing Developers Association. And so our objective with this was just to simply look at the geographic distribution of emergency rental assistance in Omaha. And then after we had that done, try to identify areas that we thought were underserved. So the way we did that is that we compared the actual ERA distribution in neighborhoods to this data that the Urban Institute put together called the ERA Priority Index to see whether high priority neighborhoods were actually receiving of the relative amount of ERA distribution. And one thing to know about Omaha in particular is that it has the same sort of racial segregation dynamics as a lot of other cities in the US. In the northeast part of the city, that's the historically redlined, disadvantaged African-American community. And in the southeast of the city is our Hispanic population, is where that's concentrated. And that'll become relevant as we look at these results. So I was able to get data from the city of Omaha on where ERA distribution is occurring. And these are all the addresses. I think it's something like 7,400 addresses of where ERA distribution is happening. But it's preferable to look at the map more like this, breaking it down by census tract. We see that northeast part of the city receiving larger amounts of emergency rental assistance. When you look at the emergency rental assistance priority index, you can start to do some comparisons between these two maps. And I'll share a link in the chat to our report, which has some nice interactive features where you can kind of swipe back and forth to see the comparisons. But the one thing that I'll point out here is in the southeast part of the city had higher priority index numbers, but lower actual numbers of distribution. So we did some fancy statistics stuff on this, primarily to find what we call sort of the predicted level of ERA distribution for each neighborhood. And that's that red line that's running through all the dots there, each of which represent a neighborhood. And so to look at underserved neighborhoods or areas, we would consider those as neighborhoods that were below the red line. In other words, they received less ERA than expected based on the priority index. So I think I can explain this if you're not a stats person. This map might help. So what this map did is just mapping the difference between that actual and predicted ERA. So a low score on this, specifically a negative score, means that the neighborhood is underserved. And usually when I do these sorts of mapping projects, you know, I have to make all sorts of qualifications and the story isn't really clear. But the story here is very clear, which is that that southeast part of Omaha, the historically Hispanic part of Omaha, is the most underserved. We put those neighborhoods up on the scatter plot there. You can see that 11 of the 12 most underserved neighborhoods in the city are in South Omaha. And so I started talking with the advocates and other people working in ERA in our city, and talked about reasons why this might be. The first one I think strikes me as pretty obvious, which is that the city of Omaha actually imposed a citizenship requirement on ERA. And the reason why is they pointed to a state law that prohibits public assistance to non-citizens. 7% of the city's population are not citizens. A greater proportion of those people live in poverty, and they're concentrated in South Omaha. There's actually another city in Nebraska, Lincoln, which doesn't have this rule. So the legal departments of those two cities kind of differed in how they interpreted the state law. But I think it's important to note that, you know, those decisions have real consequences. And then, of course, we've also talked with advocates about the language barrier and other access issues to receiving assistance in South O. We didn't stop there. We tried to sort of get some support for this and some attention on the issue. And so we were able to get in a few media outlets here with the report. And also we're really happy to see that Omaha's nonprofit partner, who is distributing rental assistance, has started a conversation with South Omaha community leaders about better ways to serve that community in specific. So that's all. I'll put the link to the full report in the chat. If you have any other thoughts or want to get in touch, there's my email. And thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Pierce. That's really important work. I know that many of us have been focused on how we can make sure that emergency rental assistance is reaching the most marginalized, the lowest income households. It's interesting to me that the two barriers you identified are ones that we have heard about from a number of other communities around, you know, imposing citizen requirements, even though it's not required by federal law, or having language barriers. I'm wondering if you have, are you doing this sort of research in other communities to look at the trends elsewhere, or how can people take this information and do this sort of research in their own communities?
Yeah, we haven't looked at other communities. We're interested in hearing from others if they've experienced these the same disparities or how it looks different in other cities. But we've kind of been solely focused on local advocacy, but would really be interested in hearing from others on that.
Wonderful. And have you shared, it sounds like the nonprofits in your community are responding to this. Have you heard anything from local elected officials or program administrators about their response to this research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is all pretty recent, really within the last 2 weeks. I think we officially published the report 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so slowly things are starting to pick up, I think. But the local organization that's administering the emergency rental assistance has started a conversation with folks, especially in the neighborhoods that we identified, to talk about some of the barriers. Of course, they don't have control over the citizenship requirement stuff. But yeah, so there is a little bit of movement there on some elements of it. But others, I think we're still trying to sort of get this in the hands of the right people.
Great, and I'm just seeing some notes in the chat about how powerful this sort of information is to addressing disparities and people thanking you for their work. There were questions about what other organizations you may have worked with in order to produce this research, and whether or not you face any barriers to getting address level information about recipients that folks should know about.
Yeah, so the main partners were Together Omaha, Nebraska Housing Developers Association, and Nebraska Appleseed. They've actually done the bulk of sort of advocacy around this. I've kind of just been the data person. And so I'm kind of more excited about that data question. Surprisingly, the city responded to public records requests with Excel files of the address level information. So there really wasn't a ton of resistance to that. And I haven't seen a ton of this in other cities. I've seen the report that the Treasury Department does for the whole country and maybe looks at it by state and things like that. But that would be my recommendation for starting, is to file a public records request, as that's sort of a formal legal process, more so than just sort of asking someone informally. And so our city has a really good streamlined way of dealing with those requests. And yeah, they didn't hesitate in providing that data. Yeah.
That's a super helpful tip. I know that a lot of our state and local partners have been trying to get similar information out of their ERA programs. They want to do a similar analysis like you've done to make sure that we're advancing racial equity at the same time that we're distributing ERA. So I appreciate your feedback on that. We're gonna move on to our next speaker, but I want to invite you to stay on and maybe answer some questions in the chat box or Q&A box if you're able to. Awesome, thank you so much. We're gonna move on to our field updates. First, we're gonna hear from Pete Harrison from Desegregate Connecticut.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut. We are a pro-homes coalition of about 80 groups across the state of Connecticut. And we are dedicated to seeing a more prosperous, sustainable, and inclusive state. Our primary lens of focusing on this from housing security is actually land use. For those, if anyone has heard of us, it's probably because we're the first advocacy group to put together a state level zoning resource. And I'm gonna throw it in the chat here. I've learned the hard way not to try to do this on Zoom because it lags a little bit. But with partnership with a couple of folks in Connecticut, on the data side, we were able to map every single zoning jurisdiction in the state of Connecticut. And what this tool has really prompted across Connecticut and actually across the country is this intersectionality between land use policy at the local level, primarily exclusionary land use policy, and the lack of housing and scarcity of affordable housing. So what we've been able to do with this tool, really we see this as a storytelling tool to talk to local planning and zoning commissioners, state level officials, and electeds, and start this long needed conversation in Connecticut in concert with other housing groups to say part of the solution to our housing shortage and crisis is reforming our land use to be more inclusive, have more diverse types of homes, from accessory dwelling units, which is a law that we passed last year, the first major zoning reform in Connecticut in 30 years. Just this past session, we proposed a transit-oriented community bill that was very similar to what passed in Massachusetts. The quirks of the Connecticut legislature that did not get passed were coming back in the new session this coming year. But I just want to highlight this resource partly because a couple of key takeaways, as one would expect, primarily residential land in Connecticut is singled exclusively for single family zoning. As of right, over 90% of Connecticut's land, in fact, falls under that classification. Conversely, only 2% of Connecticut's residential land allows multifamily housing as of right. So really what that's created over the course of the mid 20th century is Connecticut being one of the most racially and economically segregated states in the country. So it's really a tool that we found incredibly effective for general population, folks that don't know or are intimidated by zoning as it relates to housing or anything else. It's been very effective for talking to state legislatures who have, again, typically deferred land use issues to a local planning and zoning board and sort of feel like that's not the state's role, even though constitutionally it's very expressly that role. So we've slowly been able to build up the political coalition to talk about zoning as a state level intervention. Particularly proud of the transit-oriented community advocacy that we've done both in our cities and our suburbs. So that's basically prompted a further expansion. Our co-founder, Sarah Bronin, has been kind of Johnny Appleseeding these zoning atlases across the states now. We've got about 6 states developing a resource like this with some help from the Urban Institute. So my call to action here is if you're in a state that doesn't have this, or as far as you know doesn't have this resource, please do contact me. Happy to get you into conversation with Sarah and some of the other folks working on this. Land use is deeply integrated to housing policy. And we take an all of the above approach for desegregate CT, whether it's home ownership, home rentership, social housing, whatever it is. It starts with land use being legalized to build some of these things here. So really strongly encourage folks to get in touch with me to keep this conversation going. It's not the only solution, zoning reform, but it's part of the process of this all above approach to tackling the housing crisis. And we've seen some success in Connecticut that suggests we can make this happen across the country. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to go to the questions, but I will just give a little shout out to Sarah Bronin, who was a law professor at the University of Connecticut when I was there too. So that's nice to see us all come full circle on that. Can you tell us a little bit, I see a question from Ken in the chat box about how is this different than redlining, and wasn't that already illegal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ken. I mean, I think this story kind of has 2 parts to it. One is the expressly racial redlining that I think many of us are familiar. The federal government underwrote, financial institutions that did this throughout the 20th century. That was made illegal early 20th century, formally illegal in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. What happened very consciously was this sort of conversion from overtly racial exclusionary lending practices to more racial exclusionary zoning practices. So the correlation, of course, in America between class and race is pretty strong. So a town that could no longer literally prevent Black and brown families from owning a home in suburban Connecticut found another way of doing that by making requirements for 2 acres of land per single family housing, increasing the cost of housing, formally banning the allowance of construction of multifamily housing from apartments to townhouses. So in concert, across the state of Connecticut, certainly across the country, it went from a really overt racial exclusionary policies to really indirect racial policies. It's still the same effect. In some cases, it's more pernicious because it isn't overtly against the law at a state or federal level, but it in practice still has de facto exclusionary implications. So what we're trying to do is address that, make that link very clear, introduce the climate angle of this, of those laws that were racially exclusionary are now impacting our ability to be resilient against climate change, increasing this housing crisis of affordability. So that's all part of the conversation, and some of that solution is certainly allowing those kinds of smaller lot sizes, so you can have smaller homes, you can have multifamily homes, and that kind of diversity of housing type that's kind of been eliminated over the previous couple of generations in large parts of certainly Connecticut, but other parts of the country.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Pete, although it sounds like people are reacting to that with the same visceral feeling that I have, which is frustration and anger that we're seeing these racist efforts play out over and over again. I'm wondering, you mentioned that 6 states are already undertaking similar efforts. Do you know which states are doing that?
Yeah, offhand, I know New York is working on something. I believe Colorado, Utah, and I can't remember the other ones. I can certainly get back to you about that. As Johnny Appleseeding is, Sarah going to some of these different groups and having folks reach out and say, how do we do this? And the GIS implications are, we worked out the methodology, automating a lot of this work. So with each state doing it, it actually gets easier for the next state to get that data uploaded. So it's a really valuable tool. Certainly encourage folks to reach out that are curious about it. I can get back about the states that I forgot.
Yeah, please do, because then we can share a list of those 6 states in our summary follow-up so that if folks are in those states, they can dig into and try to find out a little bit more information about those projects. There is one last question about, how does the work you do, how are you hearing from NIMBY, not in my backyard folks? How are they responding to this work that so clearly connects our racist housing policy history and ongoing impacts with the zoning?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. And certainly we actually don't use terms like YIMBY, NIMBY. I don't think it's really illustrative. We're, as I mentioned, pro-homes. The other side is anti-homes. It keeps it pretty simple. But certainly across ideological perspective, political persuasion, folks in some cases are lower C conservative against change and sort of fear the unknown. Some folks have really, you'll see the Black Lives Matter sign in the front yard and they'll go and protest or write against an affordable housing development, the local planning and zoning commission. It's not hard. It's not easy in the sense of it's organization, it's outreach, it's education. Really, most of my job is speaking in front of communities, organizing pro-homes advocates on the ground to talk about what they want to see for their community, getting those kind of constituencies we've heard of on this call, those impacted communities, those working class individuals that oftentimes, are teachers or firefighters in towns they can't afford to live in, to be able to come up and speak at those meetings and speak to those legislators. So it's early days on a national level and certainly in Connecticut about this. It takes a lot of patience to put some of these dots together for folks, particularly legislators, unfortunately. But slowly and surely we've had some successes. Again, we've passed some legislation already. We'll do so again this coming session. So I think, unfortunately, the sheer scale of the crisis that we're all dealing with has made this audience wider than it would have been a few years ago. So, we've got to make the best of a very bad situation. And we're trying to do that certainly with this policy agenda.
Thanks for that, Pete. I appreciate you joining on today. If you're able to stay on to answer questions in the chat box, that would be great. Really appreciate your presentation. Now we're going to move on to Amy Regal from HoUSed, who's going to get an update from the field. Amy, are you here?
I am. Hello, thank you. And hello, I'm Amy Regal, and I'm the new executive director at the Coalition of Housing and Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. You can tell I'm new. Just 2 months into this role, taking over for the outgoing Bill Faith, who was such an amazing leader and mentor for me over the years, and really excited to be in this position. And I'm here today to introduce actually Carly, who is going to be talking about our pay to stay guide that she has put together in collaboration with HoUSed. And in our efforts as we brought together different groups through our work with the House campaign and the Erase campaign, tenant protection roundtables, as we were doing peer-to-peer calls, what we knew is that even with all of the rental assistance resources that were coming into the state, there were still so many barriers for people to be able to use that assistance due to landlords not being willing to accept the resources or just other factors that were creating barriers for our constituents. Also in the state of Ohio, there has been action to kind of undo or undercut some of the efforts to protect our tenants and to really be able to have a strong foundation for tenant protection and tenant law. And so we want to get out as many resources into the communities to be able to help them know the actions that they can take and how to do that and the lessons learned. And so this wonderful pay to stay guide has been put together. So I will turn it over to Carly to walk through the pay to stay guide and to give you some more details.
Thank you, Amy. Let me say too, right off the bat, thank you for the opportunity to work on this project. I think that together we produced a really fantastic resource for the community. And I think we're seeing a lot of really good traction come out of it as a result. If you want to pull up the slide deck, I can go ahead and dive in. Some formatting challenges here. That might be on me. You can go ahead and skip to the next slide. I am Carly Booz. I'm with the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. We're a nonprofit organization who's really here to make sure that Franklin County and Central Ohio as a region has the tools and the resources it needs to solve our housing challenge. Before I dive into what the guide is, I do want to give a huge thank you to NIHC and in particular the Erase Project, not just for the resources to make sure that we were able to put this guide together, but for the collaboration and the space to work with other advocates to kind of understand where we were able to exercise influence. It was a fantastic experience. Next slide. And I'll let you skip to the next one right after that as well. One of the things that the Alliance does is kind of our mission is that we work to solve the housing challenge, but we do it through, next slide, through research, through consultation, through education and community outreach, and through project facilitation. And I think all of those characteristics were things that were really valuable in putting this work together. I do need to say a thank you to our members, many of whom were influential in creating this and sharing their experiences as housing providers, as service providers, and as ERA providers who really had kind of that back room experience and how all of these programs were fitting together. Next slide. For context, I'm going to talk about Central Ohio because I think it's easy to kind of grapple into one smaller community instead of the state as a whole because there are so many variations. But just looking at Franklin County, we've had over 33,000 evictions filed just since COVID-19 began. We are now seeing more evictions every month than we ever did before the pandemic. But the flip side of that is that we've been able to connect over 47,000 families with rental assistance funds, including ERA, totaling about $114 million. Next slide. Unfortunately, we are what's considered a $1 one-day state. So that means that if you are a tenant and you are $1 short on rent or you are 1 day late on rent, you have no right to redeem that tenancy and you can be set out. You get a 3-day notice to evict, but you don't get a right to actually, under Ohio Revised Code, under our statutes, to pay those arrears and be able to maintain your housing. There's some really fantastic resources and research from the Northeast Ohio Coalition on the Homelessness that shows we are one of only 5 states where that remains true. I also have personal background in foreclosure defense litigation. We know that this is in stark contrast to the rights homeowners receive when they're going through a housing defense action. Between that legal environment, which is relatively unique, between the huge inflation in housing costs and rent appreciation in Ohio, and the ongoing effects of COVID-19, we are seeing increases in the number of tenants who are behind in rent, who are facing an eviction, who have the money and the willingness to pay rent, but who are being refused the right to do so. Next slide, please. And we've maintained really close connection with some of the social workers who are at the courthouses, who are working directly with clients who are in these situations. And what they're reporting is that this is an increasing phenomenon. And it's a really significant one that's affecting upwards of 10 to 15% of clients who are in eviction court on any given day. Next slide. With that background in mind, there were a few things that we knew we needed to be able to understand and convey as we were working in this space. The first is that we needed to lay a basic foundation on what the context is and what the legal situation is. Pay to stay is a relatively complex legal theory for those who aren't attorneys. It's essentially rooted in the equity defense at common law, but it doesn't exist statutorily. You start throwing those words around to a layman, it can get really complicated. So we needed a way to boil that down to something that was relatable. We also wanted to contextualize pay today, not just in COVID-19 and the ability to prevent evictions, to avoid public health challenges, to maximize our emergency rent assistance. But we also wanted people to understand that this is going to have longevity well after COVID passes. Knock wood. And then finally, we wanted to benchmark success. We wanted to show policymakers and decision makers that there was a real movement happening, that there was a lot of jurisdictions that they could learn from and build a real collegiate environment around pay to stay and eviction prevention resources generally. So go ahead in the next slide. I'm going to blow through these because I think I would strongly encourage you all to look at the guide. It's something that we're really proud of. HoUSed did a fantastic job putting it together. But some of the things that we wanted to include were a printable one sheet. We knew that having a really successful, really positive conversation with one council member was great, but having a tool that they could take to share with their colleagues and to share with their staffs was even greater. So that was something that we included right at the top of the guide. We also wanted to include hypotheticals and making sure that people could see their constituents and see their representatives in these stories and understand how it related to the work that they're already doing. Next slide. Other things we included was helping set the scene and understand how some of these different housing movements were different but related. So in Ohio, there's a lot of discussion around source of income ordinances and protections under fair housing law. There's also a lot of conversation about third-party pay protections. They all fit really well with pay to stay, but they're unique enough that we wanted to be able to show how they are different as well. And then we also have a really long Q&A section. And part of that was being able to get out ahead of some of the false narratives that we were seeing coming from people who might not be familiar with the work or might not be supportive of it, who were trying to undermine some of that progress. Next slide. Finally, we really do have this targeted as education, not advocacy. It's a place to learn and grow, and it's really targeted at municipal actors. So some of the things we wanted them to be able to see alongside of what Pay to Stay can do is how it helps meet their other goals. So we wanted to include the cost of eviction so that they understand that failing to act is not cost-free, that is something that harms their community, both from a human services perspective, from a quality of life perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And we have a number of jurisdictions, especially in Ohio, who've declared racism to be a public health crisis, which is a fantastic statement. We wanted them to be able to see how this is something that can help complement that work. And then I need to say a huge thank you to attorneys John Gilligan and Dan Anderson with the firm Ice Miller, who provided a really fantastic article going through what our home rule authority is for local city council members so that they understand this is a place where they have the jurisdiction to act. Next slide. I think we were also really cognizant of the fact that when we have an audience with policymakers, we don't need to just be talking about Pay to Stay, but we need to be linking and labeling that to the Emergency Rent Assistance Program as well, and making sure that as they're having constituent engagements, they know that we have the dollars as of today to help people stay in their homes. So in part, this was a mini commercial for our ERA program, and blatant shout out to Rentful 614, which is the eviction prevention hub here in Central Ohio. Next slide. Finally, I just want to say thank you again. I want to share all of my thanks for NLIHC, for Ohio, and for all of our members and our advisors here at the Alliance for being able to put this together. I'm happy to join with Amy and answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Carly, and thanks to Amy as well. It's such a good reminder about how disparate the renter protections are from state to state, and why we have to have solutions at the federal level so that even in states that might not be open to renter protections, that those renters also have an ability to stay in their home. I see a lot of thank yous to you, a lot of people saying that you gave a great presentation, a lot of appreciation for your work. I see one question that is saying, because I think the question is getting at is, because you have such few renter protections in this space, does that mean that you have increased homelessness in your communities? Do you see a connection there between the two?
Yeah, I think we're looking for polite ways to say yes, absolutely, unfortunately so.
Okay, and let me see if there's any other questions. Actually, I think that might be all. I really appreciate you joining. I am actually also looking forward to another organization from Ohio is testifying tomorrow at the hearing as well. I think they're going to also be touching on renter protections. So I'm going to listen out to see if they mention Pay to Stay and any of the other work that you guys are all doing in the state. But please keep up your good work, and we thank you for joining with us. We're going to squeeze in one more speaker before the end of the call. I'm going to ask Elena Calabro from our team to give a very brief update about some important changes that has been issued by Treasury about the state and local fiscal recovery funds and the emergency rental assistance. I know many of you guys are looking to use those resources, hopefully to build more affordable housing, and Elena might have the information you need to be able to advocate for that. Are you there, Elena?
Thanks so much. Yep, I'm here.
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Elena Calabro, and like Sarah mentioned, I'm just going to provide a really brief overview of the new state and local fiscal recovery guidance that Treasury released last week. They made two changes to really provide additional flexibility for states and localities to use these funds for affordable housing. So they expanded the presumptively eligible uses, and they also increased flexibility to use these funds for long-term affordable housing loans. And I will briefly touch on both of those. And also just wanted to highlight that Treasury and HUD also released an affordable housing how-to guide, which provides some examples of how localities, states and localities can layer these funds with other funding opportunities to develop more affordable housing. Next slide, please. So the updated guidance provides two different options for expanding eligibility. First, it expands the range of federal programs that are considered presumptively eligible if they meet certain core requirements. So previous guidance under the final rule limited presumptive eligibility to projects, to home and National Housing Trust Fund projects. But the new guidance expands this list of federal housing programs to include LIHTC, of course, Housing Trust Fund and Home, public housing, project-based rental assistance, and others. The full list can be found in the FAQ. And then just the four core requirements of these programs that must be met include income restrictions, affordability, and related covenant requirements, tenant protections, and then housing quality standards. Next slide, please. The second option that Treasury provides in its updated guidance, it clarifies that these funds may be used to finance the development, repair, or operation of any affordable rental housing unit that provides long-term affordability of 20 years or more to households at or below 65% of the local area median income. So that's pretty clear right there. And that's just to make people comfortable with using these funds for their housing projects. The next slide, please. So also Treasury's guidance is kind of a big deal because it achieved what a lot of you and what NLIHC supported in the Lifeline Act, which was legislation to facilitate the use of fiscal recovery funds for long-term affordable housing loans. Treasury found a way to do that through its guidance. So in the new guidance, fiscal recovery funds can be used to fund the full principal amount of certain long-term affordable housing loans. The loans must have maturity and affordability covenants for 20 years or longer. And for LIHTC, project owners must waive their right to a qualified contract. And so this is great. It will help ensure that developments are not converted, 15 years or more into the loan. And the guidance further clarifies that repayment of long-term loans can be reinvested into future affordable housing uses that are consistent with the final rule. Next slide. So it looks like a lot, but this is a really helpful guide that is in Treasury's how-to guide, little flow chart to help people determine whether an affordable housing project is eligible. So I recreated the chart in the slide, but it's also on page 2 of the how-to guide. And again, as we've mentioned, we will send the slides to everybody in a follow-up email, so you'll have access to that as well. And then also there, just to highlight too about the how-to guide, really, it's a really cool resource because it's kind of telling people how they can layer these funds, as I mentioned earlier. I won't go through it, but they provide examples of, just layering the different programs and also what types of projects those could be. And I won't go through our stuff either, but I did just want to highlight that, we have been tracking the use of these funds for housing, and you can find our resources on that through that link, and a link on the very last slide of my presentation. And finally, I also just really wanted to briefly touch on some new ERA guidance. So Treasury updated its FAQs last week to outline some flexibilities for ERA $2 that are unobligated as of October 1st. So as you might remember, under the American Rescue Plan, a grantee that has obligated at least 75% of its total ERA 2 funds on financial assistance, housing stability services, can use the funds that are unobligated on October 1st for other affordable rental housing and eviction prevention purposes. So Treasury finally outlined their guidance for what those can be. First, to be eligible, a grantee must first obligate 75% of its grant. And then that 75% benchmark, by the way, is just based on the grantee's ERA 2 grant amount as adjusted for any funds that have been voluntarily reallocated or recaptured. And you can find all this information in FAQ number 46. They added a new question to just completely deal with this issue. Next slide. So they defined eligible affordable rental housing purposes, and you can read that on the slide, but just a few highlights. The funds must serve very low income households, and any properties that receive ERA2 for capital assistance must remain affordable for a minimum of 20 years. That goes beyond what was in the statute. Treasury really wanted to make sure that these funds are targeted. The next slide, please. And Treasury also says that ERA2 funds used for capital must conform to and meet program requirements of one of the programs that's listed in the FAQ. This includes like LIHTC, Home, Housing Trust Fund, and several other programs. And Treasury says that grantees can structure ERA2 funds as loans, including no interest loans, deferred payment loans, interest subsidies, and grants. Next slide. I'm sorry, I'm going through this really fast. And then finally, the other part of that, in addition to rental housing uses, was eviction prevention purposes. This is pretty straightforward. Treasury says that they are defining eviction prevention purposes in the same way that they defined it for housing stability services. So all the things that people have already been provided with ERA. The one difference is that these funds, services provided with these specific funds must be made available, must serve very low income families. And this is different because under the ERA2 statute, regular ERA2 funds that are used for housing stability services do not need to serve eligible households. So that is a distinction. And then the next slide, yeah. So this is just the resources. We'll be writing up a memo about the new ERA guidance that I just mentioned, but you can find the other resources on this slide. And as usual, we will send a follow-up email tomorrow with links to all these resources, as well as the slides. So thank you very much. Sorry again, going fast.
I appreciate that, Elena. You have a good way of taking really complicated regulatory language and distilling it down to what folks need to know. We're going to end our call there. I appreciate everybody who was able to join on with us today. Just as a reminder, Congress will be going on recess soon, so please use our toolkit. I'm sharing it in the chat box now to start engaging with your members of Congress by doing in-person meetings or inviting them to take tours of housing developments. This is a great time for your advocacy, and I hope you use that resource. And of course, we will be following up with more information about the webinar series that Diane mentioned at the top of the call on housing and homelessness and housing first. We hope you can join with us to learn more about the causes and solutions to homelessness and ways we can work together to end it once and for all. So I'm going to end the call there. Thank you so much for joining with us, and we'll see you next time.